He remembered Sundays long ago, warm, sun-drenched mornings in a modest church in Ohio, where his mother's voice would rise above the choir, soft but sure, singing hymns about grace and steadfast love. Back then, success wasn't measured in stock options or luxury cars, but in answered prayers and shared meals. His father, a schoolteacher with calloused hands and a gentle spirit, used to say, "Son, wealth that doesn't bless others isn't wealth at all. It's just noise." Daniel let out a slow breath, fogging the glass for a second before it vanished. Now, at 38, he owned 3 companies, 2 private jets, and a name whispered with reverence in boardrooms across the globe. But the man he was, the boy who once knelt beside his bed every night saying, "God, help me be kind," felt like a stranger buried beneath layers of polished confidence and calculated charm. Inside the penthouse, a muted chime echoed, the sound of a text message. He didn't turn. He already knew it was from Vanessa. "Dinner at Le Bernardin tonight, wear the black tux. I want everyone to see you," it probably said. She always spoke in statements, not questions. Always performing, always curating. And for a while, that had been enough. Enough to fill the hollow spaces he didn't want to name. But lately, something had shifted. Not in the world around him. It still glittered, still bowed, but within. A quiet ache, like a forgotten melody playing faintly in the distance. He thought of Clara. Not the way she looked, though she'd always been beautiful in that unassuming way that made people lean in closer. No, he thought of how she'd hold his hand during thunderstorms, how she'd whisper scripture when he couldn't sleep, how she'd never once asked for a single extravagant thing. Only his presence. Daniel came a voice from the doorway, soft, hesitant. He turned. Clara stood just inside the glass doors, her hands folded over her middle. She wore a simple cream sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. And there it was, the change he hadn't let himself fully see until now. The gentle swell beneath her clothes. Life, growing, their child. His throat tightened. "You didn't answer my calls," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I didn't want to tell you like this, over voicemail or a text. I wanted you to see my face when I said it." He stepped toward her, then stopped, as if crossing the space between them might shatter something fragile. "Clara, you don't have to say anything," she interrupted gently, lifting her chin. "I just needed you to know. You're going to be a father." The words hung in the air like sacred breath. For a heartbeat, something cracked open inside him. A flicker of the boy from Ohio, the one who still remembered what it meant to be needed, not for his money, but for his heart. But then the old fear rose, the fear of vulnerability, of being ordinary, of losing control. He looked away, toward the skyline, toward the life he'd built to keep that boy buried. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Clara," he said, his voice low, almost pleading with her to understand. "Everything's moving so fast. Mergers, investors' expectations?" She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Not angry, not even disappointed anymore, just resolved. "I see," she whispered, and in that single word, Daniel felt the slow, quiet unraveling of everything he thought he'd won. He didn't know it then, standing there in his perfect penthouse with the world at his feet, that he was about to lose the only thing that had ever truly anchored him. Not because Clara would fight him, but because she would walk away with grace, carrying a secret legacy far greater than his billions, and a child who would one day remind him what real wealth looked like. But that night, all he felt was the cold glass beneath his palms, and the terrible weight of a choice he didn't yet realize would haunt him for the rest of his life. Certo, agora tu como narrador e storyteller disenvolva a historia sem marcacos com o nome de cada topico que for desenvolve. Mi conti sobrio topico tu com dialogo como su fosso espectador. Sempre lembrando de desenvolver com vida moco. Com muitos sentimentos de forma que a estrutura de narrativa utiliza uma linha temporal linear de modo o espectador sentir o que o personagem está sentindo amigos. Com 6.000 characters quen 3 max in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, where fire escapes clinked like wind chimes and the scent of jasmine drifted from window boxes, Clara Bennett walked up the worn steps of a modest brownstone, her fingers brushing the peeling paint of the handrail. She carried nothing but a canvas tote bag, 2 changes of clothes, her grandmother's Bible, and a small ultrasound photo tucked carefully between its pages. The late afternoon sun warmed her shoulders, but inside, she felt chilled, as if the wind had slipped through her ribs and settled deep in her bones. She paused at the door, listening. From within came the soft hum of a hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness," sung in a voice weathered by years but unbroken by sorrow. Her Aunt Miriam, the only family she had left in the city. Clara lifted her hand to knock, then hesitated. What would she say? He left me. He didn't even look at me when I told him about the baby. The words lodged in her throat like stones. She closed her eyes, drew a breath that trembled all the way down to her toes, and knocked twice, gentle, almost apologetic. The door opened instantly, as if Miriam had been waiting. "Oh, honey," the older woman whispered, her eyes filling before she even saw Clara's face. She pulled her into a hug so full of warmth it nearly buckled Clara's knees. Come in, child. You're safe now." Inside, the apartment smelled of chamomile tea and old books. Sunlight pooled on the hardwood floor, catching dust motes in its glow. Photographs lined the walls, mission trips to Kenya, Guatemala, Nepal. Clara's parents smiling beside children with bright eyes and worn shoes, their arms wrapped around strangers like family, because to them everyone was family. Clara sank onto the faded floral sofa, her hands instinctively cradling her stomach. She hadn't allowed herself to cry since Daniel's silence that evening on the balcony, the way he'd turned away, as if her joy were an inconvenience. But here, in this sanctuary of love that asked for nothing in return, the dam began to crack. "He didn't even ask how far along I am," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He just looked at the skyline like I was part of the noise he needed to tune out." Miriam sat beside her, her wrinkled hand covering Clara's. "That boy forgot who he was, my dear. But you never did." Clara swallowed hard. She thought of her childhood. Barefoot summers in Alabama, her father mending shoes for neighbors who couldn't pay, her mother singing lullabies in Swahili after long days at the clinic they'd built together. They'd died 5 years ago in a car accident on a rainy road in Uganda, their van skidding off a cliff while delivering medicine to a remote village. She'd been 22, alone in the world except for her faith and the memories stitched into her bones. "I just wanted him to see us," Clara said, tears finally spilling over. "Not the money, not the parties, the baby. Our baby. I thought love was supposed to stay." Miriam squeezed her hand. "Love does stay, child. But sometimes people mistake admiration for love. Daniel wanted to be worshipped, not known. And you offered him your soul. There's a difference." Clara nodded, wiping her cheeks with the back of her wrist. She opened her Bible to Psalms, her thumb instinctively finding Psalm 27:10. "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." She read it aloud, her voice shaky but clear. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the room, no thunder, no miracle, but inside her. A quiet resolve, steady as sunrise. She wasn't just Daniel's abandoned wife. She was Clara Bennett, daughter of missionaries, bearer of a quiet courage, and now the mother of a child who would know what love really looked like. Not the kind that shines under chandeliers, but the kind that kneels in the dirt to lift someone up. Later that evening, as Miriam prepared simple lentil soup in the tiny kitchen, Clara stood at the window, watching the street below. A little girl chased a red balloon, laughing as it tugged her down the sidewalk. Clara placed a hand on her belly and whispered, so softly only God could hear, "You'll never wonder if you're wanted. I promise." Outside, the city roared on, unaware that in this humble apartment, a legacy was being reborn. Not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the quiet courage of a woman who chose grace over bitterness, faith over fear, and love, even when it wasn't returned. And though her heart still ached, it also beat, strong, sure, and full of purpose. Because Clara knew, with a certainty that no abandonment could shake, that she but today was different. Today, She'd woken with a flutter deep inside. A whisper of movement so delicate it could have been imagination, except her breath caught like it knew better. The baby, her child, had stirred for the first time, not with violence or pain, but with a quiet, sacred nudge that said, "I'm here. I've always been here." Tears welled before she even opened her eyes. Downstairs, the familiar clink of porcelain and the low murmur of Miriam's morning prayer drifted up the stairs. Clara rose slowly, her body heavier now, not just with life, but with purpose. She slipped on a loose dress, the one Daniel had once called too plain, and made her way down, bare feet silent on the wooden steps. "There she is," Miriam said, smiling as she set a plate of toast and sliced peaches on the table. "You look lighter today." Clara touched her stomach again, a small, trembling smile playing on her lips. "I felt the baby move this morning." Miriam's eyes softened. "Oh, honey." She reached across the table, squeezing Clara's wrist. "That's God's first hello. A promise in motion." Clara nodded, but then her expression dimmed. "I was going to tell Daniel last night, with joy, like it was a gift. I'd even bought a little onesie, navy blue, with a tiny cross stitched on the chest. I thought he'd smile, maybe even cry." Her voice cracked, but he looked at me like I'd handed him a burden. Miriam didn't reply right away. She poured 2 cups of tea, the steam curling between them like a veil. "Some men," she said finally, "only recognize treasure when it's gone silent." Clara stared into her cup, her reflection blurred by tears. What if he never comes back? What if he never meets his own child? "Then his loss will echo louder than your pain," Miriam said gently. "But you get to raise a soul who'll know love without conditions. That's a kind of legacy no fortune can buy." Just then, Clara's phone buzzed on the table. A notification from a private email account she rarely checked. Frowning, she opened it. The subject line read, "Confidential regarding the Bennett Family Trust." Her breath hitched. She hadn't thought of the trust in years, not since her parents' lawyer had mentioned it at the funeral, saying the terms would activate under specific circumstances. She'd been too broken to ask what that meant. Now, with trembling fingers, she opened the message. "Dear Ms. Bennett, per the final directive of your parents, the Bennett Global Faith Foundation and its associated assets, valued in excess of $420 million, will be formally transferred to your stewardship upon confirmation of your pregnancy. Documentation is prepared. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience." Clara's hands shook so badly the phone nearly slipped from her grip. "Clara," Miriam asked, rising quickly. "What is it?" Clara looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. I'm not just carrying a baby, Aunt Miriam. I'm carrying the key to everything my parents built. The clinics, the orphanages, the schools in 3 continents." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "All of it. It's mine now, because I'm going to be a mother." Miriam sank back into her chair, her lips moving in silent prayer. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Somewhere in Manhattan, Daniel Whitmore sat in a glass-walled conference room, signing papers that would merge his company with a European conglomerate, and with it, seal his public engagement to Vanessa Sterling. Cameras flashed. Champagne popped. The world celebrated his new beginning. But in a sunlit kitchen in Brooklyn, a woman who'd been discarded like yesterday's news sat very still, her palm flat against the life growing within her, realizing she held not just a child, but a calling so vast it could reshape nations. And she didn't feel power. She felt weight. Holy, trembling weight. "Do you think God allowed Daniel to leave?" she whispered. "So I'd have to stand on my own, to become who I'm meant to be." Miriam reached across the table again, her voice thick with emotion. "Some doors close so you'll stop knocking and start building your own house. You're quiet," she murmured, her voice low and honeyed, designed to soothe. But beneath it flickered something sharper, something watchful. Still thinking about the merger, Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes scanning the room without focus. Something like that. He hadn't told her about Clara's pregnancy. Not yet. Every time he tried, on the drive over, during the pre-event cocktails, the words had lodged in his throat like splinters. He told himself it was for Vanessa's sake, that it would complicate things. But deep down, he knew the truth. Admitting Clara was carrying his child would force him to see her not as a ghost from his past, but as a living, breathing consequence of his choices. And consequences made him feel ordinary. Vanessa leaned closer, her perfume a mix of jasmine and ambition. "You've been distant since that night you came back late from the office. Did something happen?" He almost laughed. The office, that's what he'd called it. The lie he'd spun when he'd actually stood outside Clara's Brooklyn Street for an hour, watching the light in her aunt's window, too ashamed to knock. "Just tired," he said, forcing a smile. "Big week." She studied him, her gaze lingering a second too long. Then, with the grace of someone who'd mastered performance, she turned to greet a group of socialites drifting toward them. Laughing, air-kissing, weaving a web of influence with every syllable. But across the room, near the grand staircase draped in white orchids, a man in a charcoal overcoat stood apart from the crowd. Older, dignified, his eyes fixed not on the glitter, but on Daniel. It was Thomas Greer, the attorney who'd handled Clara's parents' estate. Daniel recognized him from a brief, tense meeting years ago, right after the funeral, when Clara had quietly declined a settlement offer from one of her father's former partners. Daniel's pulse spiked. Why is he here? Before he could move, Vanessa followed his gaze. "Do you know him?" "No." Daniel lied quickly, too quickly. But Thomas wasn't looking at him anymore. He was speaking to a woman in a floor-length emerald gown, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. Daniel's stomach dropped. Elizabeth Hartwell, philanthropist, founder of the Hartwell Initiative, and, though few knew it, one of Clara's mother's oldest friends. A woman who'd held Clara as a baby in Nairobi. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. She's powerful, connected to that old missionary circle, the ones who still run half the NGOs in Africa. She turned to Daniel, a slow, calculating smile forming. "Maybe we should say hello. People like her open doors even money can't buy." Daniel felt a cold dread coil in his chest. "It's not necessary." But Vanessa was already gliding forward, pulling him with her like a current. As they approached, Elizabeth's expression shifted, just barely, from warm to guarded. Thomas gave a curt nod. "Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said, her voice cool but polite. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Daniel managed, his mouth dry. Vanessa extended her hand. "Vanessa Sterling, I've admired your work for years, Mrs. Hartwell, especially your stance on ethical wealth." Elizabeth's eyes flickered to Daniel, then back to Vanessa. "Ethical wealth," she repeated softly, "requires more than a title. It requires a clean conscience." An awkward silence fell. Then Thomas cleared his throat. "Actually, we were just discussing a new initiative in Southeast Asia. A foundation recently reactivated its mission, led by a remarkable young woman, Clara Bennett. Perhaps you've heard of her." Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but her fingers tightened on Daniel's arm. Daniel's breath stopped. "Clara," he blurted before he could stop himself. Elizabeth turned to him, her gaze steady, almost sorrowful. "Yes, she's expecting, a boy, and she's stepping into a role far greater than any boardroom could offer. She's rebuilding her parents' legacy. One village, one soul at a time." The room seemed to tilt. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all faded into white noise. All Daniel could hear was the echo of Clara's voice on that balcony. "You're going to be a father." And now the world knew, not just that she was carrying his child, but that she was more than he'd ever allowed himself to see. Vanessa recovered first. "How noble," she said, though her voice dripped with something bitter. Still playing the saint, even abandoned. Elizabeth's eyes hardened. "Some saints," she said quietly, "don't need thrones to shine." She turned away, leaving Daniel standing there, exposed. Later, in the back of the town car, Vanessa sat in silence for a long time. Then, without looking at him, she said, "So, you left a pregnant wife for me." It wasn't a question. Daniel stared out the window at the passing lights, each one a reflection of a life he'd mistaken for meaning. I didn't know she was pregnant when I left. But you know now, Vanessa said, her voice flat. And yet you said nothing. To me. To anyone. She finally turned, her eyes sharp, wounded in a way that surprised him. Do you have any idea what people will say, that I stole a man from his unborn child, that I'm the villain in some modern parable? I never meant... You never think? She snapped, then softened instantly, as if remembering her role. She smoothed her dress, her mask slipping back into place. But it doesn't matter. We'll manage the narrative. People forget. Scandals fade. But Daniel didn't feel reassured. He felt haunted, because for the first time, he saw Clara not as a quiet wife he'd outgrown, but as a force awakening. And worse, he saw himself not as the hero of his own story, but as the man who walked away just before the miracle began. Back in Brooklyn, miles away, Clara stood on the brownstone steps, looking up at the stars, one hand on her belly, the other clutching a letter from the foundation's board. Tomorrow, she would meet with Elizabeth Hartwell. Tomorrow, her life would change again. But tonight, she whispered into the night air, he'll know you, my love, even if it takes him a lifetime. He'll know you. And somewhere in the city, Daniel Whitmore lay awake, haunted by the ghost of a future he'd thrown away, and the growing fear that it might already be too late. To his phone buzzed. Another message from his PR team. We need to prep a statement. Rumors are spreading about Clara Bennett's foundation. Some outlets are calling her the heiress who forgave the billionaire. He winced. Forgave. As if forgiveness were already granted, when he hadn't even asked for it. Then, a quieter notification. A personal email from Thomas Greer, timestamped 5:03 a.m. Mr. Whitmore, per Clara Bennett's instructions. I am formally notifying you she has accepted stewardship of the Bennett Global Faith Foundation. She has also filed to establish sole custody of your unborn child. She does not seek financial support. She seeks peace. Please respect her wishes. T. Greer. Daniel read it 3 times, each word like a nail. She doesn't seek financial support. Of course she didn't. Clara had never wanted his money, only his heart. And he'd handed it back to her wrapped in indifference. He stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee. Dark liquid spilled across marble like a stain he couldn't clean. He grabbed his coat and keys without thinking, driven by something deeper than logic. A raw, desperate need to see her, to explain, to beg, to do something before she disappeared into a life where he was just a footnote. 40 minutes later, his car idled outside Aunt Miriam's brownstone. Rain streaked the windshield, blurring the warm light glowing from the second-floor window. He didn't get out. Couldn't. What would he say? I'm sorry I chose glitter over grace. I didn't realize you were worth more than my ego. From inside, a laugh floated out, soft, melodic. Clara's laugh. He hadn't heard it in months. And then the front door opened. Not Clara, but Miriam, holding an umbrella, speaking gently to a young woman with a toddler on her hip. They exchanged a bag of groceries, and Miriam pressed something into the woman's hand. Likely cash, likely unasked for. The kind of quiet generosity Daniel used to mock as naive. He watched as Miriam turned to go back inside, and then froze. Clara stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other cradling her belly. She was wearing a faded yellow dress, her hair loose, her face bare of makeup, and she was looking straight at his car. She knew he was there. His breath caught. He should drive away, give her the peace she asked for. But he couldn't move. After a long moment, Clara stepped out onto the porch, rain misting around her like a halo. She didn't approach, didn't gesture. She just stood there, calm, present, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. Daniel finally opened the car door. He walked toward her, his shoes soaked, his heart hammering. When he reached the bottom step, he stopped. Clara, he began, voice rough. You don't have to say anything, she said softly, just like that night on the balcony. But this time, her eyes held no plea, only quiet strength. I felt you before I saw you, like a storm I used to love, until I learned how to build my house on rock instead of sand. He flinched. I didn't know about the foundation, about everything. I didn't tell you because it wasn't about you, she said. It's about the child, about the mission God gave my parents, and now me. I'm not angry, Daniel, but I can't live in the shadow of your choices anymore. He looked down at his hands that signed billion-dollar deals but couldn't hold on to what mattered. What if I want to change? What if I want to be part of his life? She was silent for a long time. Rain tapped gently on the awning above them. Want isn't enough, she said finally. You have to choose. Not once. Every day. And right now, you're still choosing the world that told you I wasn't enough. He opened his mouth to argue, but the truth of it hit him like a wave. He was still wearing the suit, still driving the car, still orbiting a life built on being seen, not known. I love you, he whispered. The words raw, unexpected, even to himself. Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Maybe you do, but love without sacrifice is just another kind of loneliness. She turned slightly, glancing back at the open door where the golden light of home waited. Go home, Daniel. Not to your penthouse, to your soul. And if you find it, maybe one day you'll find us. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. Not slammed, not locked with fury, just closed. With finality, Daniel stood in the rain, water streaming down his face, unsure if it was rain or tears. He looked up at the window, just in time to see Clara's silhouette pause, her hand resting on the glass, as if she, too, was saying goodbye to the man he could have been. Inside, Miriam placed a warm shawl over Clara's shoulders. He'll either break or be rebuilt, she said gently. Clara nodded, her voice steady. And if he's rebuilt, it won't be for me. It'll be for the baby. That's how I'll know it's real. Outside, Daniel finally turned and walked back to his car. But this time, he didn't look back, because somewhere in the ache of that moment, something in him had cracked open. Not to shatter, but to let the light in. Aunt Miriam set a steaming mug of ginger tea before her, the scent curling into the air like a prayer. You're thinking about him, she said, not as a question. Clara nodded slowly. I keep wondering if I was too hard, if I shut the door too fast. Miriam pulled out the chair across from her, her movements unhurried, wise. Child, you didn't shut a door. You just stopped holding it open for someone who kept walking away. Clara looked down at her belly, where the baby had been restless all night, kicking in strong little pulses, as if sensing the storm outside and within. He said he loves me. And maybe he does, Miriam said gently. But love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't love. It's nostalgia. You deserve more than a man who only wants you when he's lost everything else. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. I don't want our son to grow up believing he wasn't worth staying for. He won't, Miriam said firmly, because you'll teach him the truth that his worth was never tied to his father's choices. And if Daniel ever truly returns, not with words but with sacrifice, then God will make a way. But you can't build your life waiting for a maybe. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Both women looked up, surprised. No one ever came this early. Miriam rose and opened it a crack. Standing on the porch was a young woman Clara recognized from the neighborhood. Lena, who worked 2 jobs and lived 3 blocks over with her grandmother. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her coat too thin for the season. Mrs. Bennett, Lena whispered, voice trembling. I saw you helped Maria last week with her rent, and I didn't know where else to go. Clara rose instantly, heart pounding. Come in, please. Lena stepped inside, wringing her hands. My hours got cut. Again. And my grandma's medicine. I can't. Her voice broke. Without hesitation, Clara reached for her old canvas bag on the counter, the one that had held her Bible and ultrasound photo weeks ago. Now, it held something else, a check from the Foundation's interim fund, signed just yesterday. She pressed it into Lena's hand. This will cover rent and medicine for the next 3 months. And starting Monday, we're opening a community support circle at the church on Elm. Hot meals, childcare, job resources. You'll be the first person I call. Lena stared at the check, then at Clara, tears spilling freely. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Clara placed a hand on her stomach, her voice soft but sure. "Because someone once told me that every life matters, even the ones the world forgets. And I believe it." When Lena left, wrapped in a borrowed scarf and carrying hope like a fragile bird, Miriam turned to Clara with new awe in her eyes. "You're not just accepting the foundation, are you? You're becoming it." Clara sank back into her chair, exhausted but radiant. "It's not mine, Aunt Miriam. It's a stewardship. And this baby, he's my first mission field." Later that afternoon, as Clara sorted through foundation documents at the table, her phone buzzed. A call from Elizabeth Hartwell. "Clara." The older woman's voice was warm but urgent. "The board met this morning. There's been interest. Powerful people don't like when quiet women inherit power they can't control. Be careful." A chill ran down Clara's spine. "What kind of interest?" A reporter from the Chronicle called, asking about your sudden rise and your estranged billionaire husband. "They're digging, trying to turn your grief into gossip." Clara closed her eyes. She'd known this would come. The world didn't honor grace, it sensationalized it. "Let them dig," she said after a moment, her voice steady. "They'll only find truth." She hung up and walked to the window, watching children play in the puddles below. Somewhere out there, Daniel was still navigating his gilded cage. Vanessa was plotting her next move, and faceless journalists were sharpening their pens. But here, in this humble kitchen, surrounded by tea steam and the quiet rhythm of a child's heartbeat, Clara felt an unshakable peace. Because she wasn't fighting for attention. She was building a legacy. And legacies aren't built in headlines. They're built in homes like this one, where broken women become warriors, where abandoned wives become mothers of movements, and where every act of kindness is a quiet rebellion against a world that worships power over people. That night, as she knelt beside her bed to pray, she whispered, "God, if Daniel ever finds his way back, let it be because he found you first. And if he doesn't, let my son never doubt that he was loved before he took his first breath." Outside, the rain had stopped, and in the stillness, a single star burned through the clouds, small, distant, but undeniably there. "You're late," she said, voice smooth as glass. "I was beginning to think you'd gone back to Brooklyn." Daniel unbuttoned his coat slowly, avoiding her gaze. "I had a call with the Singapore team. A likely story." She set her glass down with deliberate calm. "I saw the tabloid this morning. Billionaire's secret heir pregnant wife steps into global empire. You do realize half our investors read that before breakfast." He flinched. "It's not a secret. It's the truth." "Truth is irrelevant," she snapped, then instantly softened, smoothing her gloves. "What matters is perception. And right now, you look like a man who traded a saint for a socialite and lost everything in the deal." He sat across from her, the weight of her words pressing like stone. "Is that what I did?" Vanessa leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Don't get sentimental, Daniel. You made a choice. You chose me. You chose this life, speed, spotlight, control." Clara was quiet, uncomplicated, boring. She said it like it was fact, not opinion. But something in him resisted. She wasn't boring. She was present. "And I didn't choose you over her because you were exciting. I chose you because you never asked me to be anything but what the world already saw." Vanessa's mask flickered, just for a second. "And what's wrong with that? People like us don't have the luxury of soul-searching. We build empires, Daniel, not soup kitchens." He looked at her then, not at the designer dress, not at the carefully curated confidence, but at the woman beneath it. And for the first time, he saw the fear, the hunger, the emptiness she masked with power. "You don't even know her name," he said quietly. "You've never said Clara out loud." She stiffened. "Why would I? She's irrelevant." "Is she?" He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table. On the screen was a photo, one of the foundation's press releases. Clara, standing outside a new maternal health clinic in Nairobi, sunlight in her hair, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding the hand of a young mother. Behind her, a banner read Bennett Hope Initiative. Healing begins with dignity. Vanessa stared at it, her lips tightening. Photos can be staged. Her foundation just pledged $20 million to rebuild 3 war-torn villages in Sudan, Daniel said, voice low. No press tour, no interviews, just action, while we argue over centerpieces. Silence stretched between them, thick and brittle. Then Vanessa laughed. A short, brittle sound. Oh, Daniel, don't tell me you're having a crisis of conscience. That's so middle class. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he looked out the window at the city he'd conquered, now feeling less like a kingdom and more like a gilded cage. I used to think success meant never needing anyone. But Clara, she showed me that real strength is letting someone see your cracks and trusting them not to pour salt in. Vanessa's eyes flashed. And look where that got her. Alone, pregnant, forgotten, until she inherited a fortune. No, Daniel said, turning back to her, his voice steady now. She was never forgotten. She was just never seen by me. And that's on me, not her. The waiter arrived with their appetizers, sensing the tension, and retreated quickly. Vanessa picked up her fork but didn't eat. So what now? You're going back to her, to that little house with no concierge and no view? I don't know what's next, Daniel admitted. But I know I can't keep pretending this, he gestured between them, means anything real. For the first time, genuine panic flickered in Vanessa's eyes. You'll lose everything. The board, the partnerships, the image. Maybe, he said softly, or maybe I'll finally gain something worth keeping. He stood, tossing his napkin on the table. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm just done lying to you, to the world, and to myself. As he turned to leave, Vanessa's voice stopped him, softer now, almost pleading. Daniel, what if I need you? He paused at the door, back to her. Then you've been needing the wrong man. Outside, the night air hit him like a baptism. He didn't go home. Instead, he walked block after block, until he found himself at the edge of Central Park, where the city's roar faded into rustling leaves and distant laughter. He pulled out his phone again, not to scroll, but to reread Thomas Greer's email. Then, with fingers that trembled not from cold but from resolve, he typed a new message. Mr. Greer, please tell Clara, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be the father her son deserves. However long it takes, however hard it is. Daniel, he hit send before he could change his mind. And as he stood there beneath the trees, the first snow of the season began to, who sends paper letters anymore, Miriam murmured. Clara turned the envelope over. No return address, just her name, written in elegant, looping script, Clara Elizabeth Bennett. Her pulse quickened. That middle name, Elizabeth, hadn't been used since her mother passed. Only family knew it. She broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet bore a message that stopped her breath. My dear Clara, the time has come. The vault beneath St. Agnes Chapel in Geneva will open only for you, and only once. Come before the winter moon wanes. Bring your mother's locket. It is the key. E.H. Elizabeth Hartwell. Clara's hand flew to her neck, where the simple silver locket had rested since she was 12. A gift from her mother, engraved with a single word, Veritas. Truth. What is it? Miriam asked softly. Clara looked up, eyes wide. They never told me everything. My parents. They hid more than a foundation. 2 days later, she stood in the quiet nave of St. Agnes Chapel, snow falling gently beyond the stained glass. The chapel was unassuming. Stone walls, worn pews, a single candle flickering before a statue of Mary. But beneath her feet, Clara felt it, a hum, a presence, as if centuries of prayers had seeped into the earth. An elderly priest, Father Laurent, met her at the door. His eyes softened when he saw the locket. Ah, you are the daughter. He led her down a narrow stone staircase into a crypt-like chamber lit by lanterns. At the far end stood an iron door, ancient and unmarked. In its center was a keyhole shaped like a cross. Clara's fingers trembled as she unclasped the locket. Inside wasn't a photo, as she'd always assumed, but a tiny silver disc etched with coordinates and a phrase in Latin fortis in fide, non in oro, strong in faith, not in gold. She pressed the disc into the keyhole. With a deep groan, the door swung open. Inside, not gold bars or jewels, but rows of leather-bound ledgers, shelves of microfilm, and a single mahogany desk. On it sat a final letter, addressed to her in her father's handwriting. She sank into the chair, tears blurring her vision as she read, "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, you've already chosen the harder path, the one of compassion over comfort. The fortune you've inherited is real, yes, but it is not the true legacy. This vault contains the names of every child our clinics saved, every village we rebuilt, every life restored through quiet acts of obedience. But it also contains something else, proof that the Whitmore Corporation, long before Daniel's time, illegally seized land in Uganda that belonged to our mission. The very land where your mother and I died was once stolen from the people we served. We forgave, but we never forgot. Now, the choice is yours: expose the truth and risk Daniel's empire, or continue the work in silence, letting grace cover what justice could not. Whatever you choose, know this: you are loved. Not for what you do, but for who you are, a daughter of the Most High." Dad. Clara covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. The weight of it crashed over her. Not just a fortune, but a moral reckoning. Hours later, back in her small Geneva hotel room, she video-called Miriam. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I have to decide," she whispered. "If I reveal the truth about Whitmore's origins, Daniel could lose everything. His company, his name, maybe even his freedom. But if I stay silent, am I complicit?" Miriam was quiet for a long time. "Then what would your parents have done?" Clara closed her eyes. She saw her mother kneeling beside a sick child in a mud hut, humming a hymn. She saw her father handing their last loaf of bread to a starving family, saying, "God provides." "They'd choose mercy," she said softly, "but they'd also demand repentance." Just then, her phone chimed. A message from Thomas Greer. "Clara, Vanessa Sterling just contacted our office. She's offering a confidential settlement in exchange for your silence about the Foundation's origins. She claims Daniel doesn't know. Be careful. She's playing a deeper game." Clara's blood ran cold. Vanessa wasn't just protecting Daniel's image. She was protecting her own future as his wife, his successor, his heir, and she'd do anything to bury the past. That night, Clara stood on the hotel balcony, snow dusting her shoulders, her hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked, strong, insistent. She whispered into the winter air, "I won't let fear decide your story," because now she understood the real inheritance wasn't the money, the vault, or even the foundation. It was the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you everything. And as the moon, she stepped onto the tarmac wrapped in a long wool coat, her hand resting on her belly as if shielding the future within. Waiting for her at the hangar's edge wasn't Thomas Greer, as she'd expected, but a man she hadn't seen in years, Elias Carter, her father's oldest friend and the original legal guardian of the Bennett Trust. His silver hair was thinner, his posture more stooped, but his eyes held the same fire that had once defended missionaries in war zones. "Clara," he said, voice thick with emotion as he took her hands. "You look like your mother the day she stood before the UN and asked the world to see Africa not as a problem, but as a promise." She managed a small smile. "I hope I can live up to that." He led her to a waiting town car, its windows tinted against the prying eyes of the city already waking to gossip and speculation. As they pulled onto the highway, Elias finally spoke the words she'd been dreading and waiting for. "The board convened an emergency session last night," he said. "Vanessa's people leaked a fabricated audit suggesting the Foundation's funds are tied to unverified assets. They're trying to freeze the accounts before you officially take control." Clara's breath caught. "They're moving faster than I thought." "They're afraid," Elias said simply, "because they finally understand you're not just an heiress. You're a reckoning." He handed her a manila envelope. Inside were deeds, incorporation papers, and a single photograph. her parents standing beside a young Daniel Whitmore, no older than 10, shaking hands with her father at a charity gala. The caption read, "Partners in Promise, 2002. He knew them," Clara whispered, heart pounding. Daniel actually knew them. His father sat on your parents' advisory council for years, Elias confirmed. Until the land dispute, until silence became more profitable than truth. Clara closed her eyes. So Daniel hadn't just married her by accident. There was history, a thread woven long before either of them knew its weight. The car stopped outside a sleek midtown law firm, Greer and Price. Inside, Thomas awaited her in a conference room bathed in morning light. He rose immediately, his usual reserve softened by urgency. "Clara, thank God you're back. The probate judge is willing to fast-track your appointment as sole trustee, but only if you appear in person today. And there's more." He hesitated. "Vanessa filed a petition claiming you're emotionally unstable due to abandonment and unfit to manage assets of this magnitude. She's demanding a psychological evaluation." Clara's stomach twisted, but she didn't flinch. "She's trying to paint me as broken so she can position herself as the stable one." "Exactly," Thomas said. "And if the court delays even a week, Vanessa's allies on the board could vote to dissolve the foundation's operational authority. The money would be preserved in their hands." Silence fell. Outside, sirens wailed. Somewhere in this city, Daniel was likely signing another deal, unaware that the ground beneath his legacy was crumbling. Not from scandal, but from a truth he never knew existed. Clara placed both hands flat on the table, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Then I'll testify, today, and I'll bring the vault records. Every ledger, every deed, every act of grace my parents poured into this world. Proof that this foundation isn't built on wealth, but on witness." Thomas exchanged a glance with Elias. "You understand what this means once you step into that courtroom. There's no going back. The world will know everything. The inheritance, the land, Daniel's family's role." "I know," Clara said softly. Then she looked down at her belly, where her son gave a firm kick, as if urging her forward. "But he deserves a mother who doesn't hide. And maybe, just maybe, a father who finally learns the whole story." An hour later, she stood outside the courthouse, reporters already gathering like vultures. Cameras flashed. Shouts erupted. "Clara, is it true you're worth $500 million? Are you suing Daniel? Is the baby his?" She paused at the top of the steps, the winter wind tugging at her coat. Then she turned, not to address them, but to look back at the city skyline, where somewhere high above, a man she once loved was still choosing between image and integrity. She whispered so only God could hear, "Let truth be kind, but let it be true." And with her head held high, Clara Bennett, daughter of missionaries, mother of a son she'd already named Eli for "My God is Most High," walked into the courthouse not as a victim, not as a billionaire, but as a woman who refused to let fear write the next chapter. Because the real legacy had never been about money. It had always been of Vanessa herself wasn't present. Not yet. But her influence was everywhere, in the skeptical glance of the judge, in the murmurs of reporters outside, in the way even some of Clara's own board members avoided her eyes. Then, just as the clerk called the case, the courtroom doors swung open. Vanessa entered. Not in a power suit, but in soft ivory silk, hair loose, eyes glistening with rehearsed vulnerability. She carried no briefcase, only a small leather journal. She looked less like a socialite and more like a wounded angel. Precisely the image she'd crafted. She took the stand first. "Miss Sterling," the judge began, "you've petitioned this court to delay Ms. Bennett's appointment as trustee, citing emotional instability. Please elaborate." Vanessa clasped her hands, voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "Your Honor, I care deeply for Daniel, and for months, I've watched Clara's behavior. She vanished after he left her, only to reappear with claims of a secret fortune. She's isolated, unpredictable. Just last week, she flew to Geneva alone while heavily pregnant. That's not prudence, it's volatility." She paused, letting the accusation hang. Then, softer, I only want what's best. For the foundation. For the vulnerable people it serves. Entrusting $500 million and global operations to someone in emotional crisis, it's not just risky. It's reckless. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. She saw the performance for what it was, a masterstroke of manipulation, wrapped in concern like poison in honey. When it was her turn, Clara rose slowly, one hand resting on the table for balance. The judge looked at her with wary eyes. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "respond to these claims." She didn't reach for notes. She didn't need them. "Your Honor," she began, voice clear and steady, "Vanessa calls my actions unpredictable because I chose truth over convenience. She calls me volatile because I flew to Geneva not for luxury, but to open a vault that holds decades of humanitarian work, signed in blood, sweat, and faith by my parents." She turned slightly to face Vanessa, not with anger, but with sorrow. "You say you care about the foundation, but you've never once asked what it does. You only care what it's worth." Vanessa's mask flickered. Clara continued, pulling a single ledger from her bag. "This is from 2017. It lists every child vaccinated in South Sudan by our mobile clinics. Page 214. My mother's handwriting. Notes a little boy named Amari who couldn't walk. They built him braces. Last month, he graduated medical school. He's coming to work with us." She looked at the judge now, eyes glistening. "This foundation isn't an asset. It's a covenant. And I would rather burn every dollar than let it become a trophy for people who see compassion as weakness." A murmur rippled through the room. Then, just as the judge leaned forward to speak, the doors opened again. This time it was Daniel. He stood in the hallway, coat dusted with snow, eyes wide as he took in the scene. Clara radiant in her resolve, Vanessa frozen in her performance, the gavel hovering midair. He hadn't planned to come, but Thomas had called him that morning. "She's testifying about your family's past, about the land in Uganda." And something in him, some buried instinct, some last shred of honor, had made him run. He stepped inside. Reporters gasped. Cameras flashed. Vanessa turned, her face draining of color. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" He walked past her like she was smoke. He stopped a few feet from Clara, not touching her, not speaking to her, but facing the judge. "Your Honor," Daniel said, voice rough but unwavering. "I am Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Global, and I'm here to confirm everything Clara Bennett says about my family's past is true." Silence crashed over the room like a wave. Vanessa shot to her feet. "Daniel, don't." He turned to her then, eyes blazing. "You knew about the vault, about the land. You've been trying to bury this to protect your future, not mine." "I was protecting us," she cried, voice cracking. "No," he said quietly. "You were protecting your illusion." He looked back at Clara, his voice breaking. "My grandfather stole that land. My father covered it up. And I married you without ever asking why your parents' mission was built on the very soil my family took." He swallowed hard. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Clara, but I won't let her silence your truth." Clara stared at him, tears spilling freely now, not from pain, but from the sheer shock of seeing him again. The man she'd once believed in, standing in the light, finally. The judge cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Given this new testimony, the petition to delay is denied. Ms. Bennett is hereby confirmed as sole trustee of the Bennett Global Faith Foundation." As the gavel fell, Vanessa stood trembling, her perfect facade shattered. She didn't speak. She simply turned and walked out, heels clicking like a countdown to the end of everything she'd built on sand. Outside, snow began to fall again. And in that courtroom, surrounded by strangers and silence, Clara placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "He's coming home, Eli, not because he earned it, but because grace is louder than shame." Daniel didn't move toward her. Not yet. He simply stood in the space between them, the space of brokenness, repentance, and the fragile, trembling hope of she didn't look back. Not even when she heard his footsteps behind her. Slower, hesitant. as if he feared approaching too soon would shatter the fragile truth had just forged. "Clara," he called softly just once. She stopped at the curb, snow dusting her lashes. She didn't turn, but she didn't keep walking either. He came to stand a few feet away, breath visible in the cold. "I don't expect you to trust me," he said, voice raw. "But I needed you to know I didn't come for the foundation. I came because I finally read the letter your father left. And I saw my grandfather's initials on the land deed. I saw the date, the lies." He swallowed hard. "I saw myself in them." Clara finally turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, unguarded. No longer the polished billionaire, but a man stripped bare by regret. And yet, she felt no surge of triumph. Only sorrow. For him. For them. For the years lost to pride. "You said you'd step into my life if you changed," she said quietly. "But how do I know this isn't just another performance, another boardroom strategy?" He flinched, as if she'd struck him. "Because I've lost everything," he whispered. "Vanessa's gone. The board's in chaos. My name's tied to a scandal I didn't even know existed." He looked down at his hands, the hands that once signed billion-dollar deals. "And for the first time, I'm glad, because maybe now I can finally be known, instead of just admired." A silence settled between them, filled only by the hush of falling snow. Then Clara placed a hand on her stomach. "He kicked this morning, right after the judge spoke. Like he knew justice had been served." Daniel's breath hitched. Can I feel?" She studied him. The hope in his eyes, the tremor in his voice. Not entitlement, not demand. A plea. Slowly, she nodded. He stepped forward, hesitating just before touching her. Then, with infinite care, he laid his palm over hers on her belly. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a firm, rolling movement beneath his hand. His eyes filled instantly. "He's strong," he whispered. "He is," Clara said. "And he'll need a father who chooses truth, even when it costs him." "I will," Daniel said, voice breaking. "Every day, however long it takes." But as they stood there in the snow, a black sedan pulled to the curb. The window rolled down. It was Elias. "Clara," he called urgently. "You need to come. Now." She frowned. "What is it?" Elias's face was grim. "Vanessa just filed an emergency motion with the SEC. She's claiming you used foundation funds to bribe the judge, and that Daniel's testimony was coerced. She's trying to trigger a federal investigation." Clara's blood ran cold. "She's desperate. Desperate people are dangerous," Elias said. "And she's not done." Daniel stepped back instantly, jaw tight. "I'll handle her." "No," Clara said sharply. Then, softer, "This isn't your battle. Not yet." She turned to him, snow catching in her hair like tiny stars. "If you really want to be part of this life, you don't fight for me. You fight with me, but only if I ask." He nodded, humbled. "Then ask." She looked at him for a long moment, really looked. Saw the boy from Ohio beneath the suits, the man who once held her during thunderstorms, the father who just felt his son move for the first time. "Then come with me," she said. "But leave your name at the door. From here on, you're not Daniel Whitmore, billionaire. You're just Daniel, a man learning to walk in grace." He exhaled, as if shedding a skin he'd outgrown. "I'd like that." They got into the car together. Not as husband and wife, not as enemies, but as two souls standing at the edge of something new. As the sedan pulled away, Clara opened her phone and typed a message to Thomas: "Schedule a press conference tomorrow. Not to defend myself. To announce the Foundation's new initiative, the Truth and Restoration Project. We'll publicly release every document from the Geneva vault, including Whitmore's land seizure. And we'll invite victims to the table for reparations, not excuses." Then she leaned her head back, closing her eyes as the city blurred past. She wasn't afraid anymore, because the inheritance wasn't just money or mission. It was the courage to let truth burn away the false, and rebuild what's left on something that lasts. And as the car turned toward Brooklyn, the snow began to clear. Not because the outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the glass like a heartbeat seeking rhythm. He traced the embossed cross on the cover, his thumb brushing over the inscription she'd written inside for Daniel. May you always find your way home. Clara. He hadn't known then that home wasn't a place, but a posture of the heart. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from his CFO, Vanessa, just leaked internal emails to the Chronicle. They're running a piece tomorrow, heiress or hoax, the dark truth behind Clara Bennett's empire. She's painting you as a pawn. Says you're being manipulated. Daniel stared at the words, but they didn't ignite the defensive fire he once would have felt. Instead, a strange peace settled over him. A clarity born not of control, but of surrender. He picked up his phone and dialed. Clara answered on the second ring, her voice soft with fatigue but alert. Daniel, I just read Psalm 27, he said, voice rough. The part where David says, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. He paused, throat tight. I always thought that was about orphans, but it's about anyone who's lost their way and finally stops running. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rain and the quiet hum of her breath on the other end. I'm scared, he admitted, the words raw. Not of the scandal, not of losing money. I'm scared that even if I spend the rest of my life trying, it won't be enough to deserve you. Or him. Clara exhaled slowly. Daniel, grace isn't earned. It's received. And it's not about deserving. It's about choosing, again and again, to walk in the light. He closed his eyes. I want to choose it. But what if I fail again? You will, she said gently. We all do. But what matters is where you run after you fall. Do you hide or do you come back? Even if it's on your knees, tears slipped down his cheeks, hot against the chill of the room. I'm coming back, Clara. Not for the cameras. Not for redemption on my terms. But because I finally see the life I thought was mine was never really living. Another silence. Then, softer, there's a chapel near the foundation office. St. Luke's. They hold a sunrise prayer service every Thursday. Aunt Miriam goes. I've been meaning to join her. She paused. Would you come with me tomorrow just to sit? Not to speak. Just to be still. His breath caught. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I'll be there. He hung up and stood, walking to the balcony. The rain had softened to a mist, the city lights shimmering like distant stars. For the first time in years, he didn't see an empire below. He saw people, hurting, hoping, hungry for something real. Back inside, he opened his laptop and typed a resignation letter. Not to the board, but to the life he'd built on sand. He would step down as CEO within the month. Not in shame, but in stewardship. He'd use what remained of his influence not to rebuild his name, but to amplify hers. And then, just before dawn, he knelt beside his bed. The same bed where he'd once ignored her whispered prayers. And for the first time since childhood, he prayed not for success, but for surrender. God, he whispered into the quiet. I don't know how to be the man they need, but if you're real, show me. One step at a time. Outside, the first pale streaks of morning painted the sky. In Brooklyn, Clara stirred in her sleep, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching her own Bible. And in that sacred hour between night and day, two broken hearts, once stirring a cup of chamomile tea gone cold. It was Thursday, the day she'd asked Daniel to meet her at St. Luke's Chapel. She hadn't slept much, not because of the baby's restless kicks, but because of the article. Heiress or hoax? The headline screamed from every newsstand, every social feed. Vanessa's carefully crafted narrative painted Clara as a manipulative schemer who'd seduced a vulnerable billionaire, then leveraged a secret inheritance to control him. Worse, it insinuated the foundation was a shell, a glamorous front to launder influence. But the cruelest line was buried in paragraph 12. Sources close to Mr. Whitmore say, he only attended the hearing under emotional duress, pressured by Bennett's spiritual coercion. Clara had read it 3 times, each word like a shard of glass. Aunt Miriam entered quietly, placing a fresh mug beside her. You're thinking about it again. Clara nodded, not turning. What if people believe her? What if they think I used God as a weapon? Miriam's voice was gentle but firm. Truth doesn't fear lies, child. It just keeps walking. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Both women exchanged a glance. It was too early for visitors. Clara opened it and froze. Daniel stood on the steps, not in a tailored coat, but in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, his hair damp from the morning mist. In his hands, he held 2 paper cups of coffee and a worn copy of the very newspaper that had tried to destroy her. "I read it," he said, his voice low and steady. "Every word. And then I wrote this." He handed her a single sheet of paper, typed, signed, dated. She unfolded it with trembling hands. Public statement by Daniel Whitmore. The recent article alleging coercion, manipulation, or deceit by Clara Bennett is categorically false. I attended the courthouse of my own free will, driven not by pressure, but by conscience. Clara has never used faith to control me. She used it to see me even when I refused to look at myself. If anyone has been spiritually coerced, it was me, by the quiet persistence of grace. I am stepping down as CEO of Whitmore Global to dedicate my life to restorative justice alongside the Bennett Foundation. I do so not as a savior, but as a servant. And I ask only this: believe her. She's been telling the truth all along. Clara's eyes filled. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," he said, "because silence is complicity. And I've been silent long enough." She looked up at him, really looked, saw the circles under his eyes, the new humility in his posture, the absence of the practiced charm that once masked his fear. This man wasn't performing. He was present. "Did you go to the chapel?" she asked softly. "I got there at 5:30 a.m., he admitted, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. Sat in the back pew, didn't say a word, just listened to the prayers, to the silence, to my own heart for the first time in years." Miriam cleared her throat gently from the doorway. "Well, since you're both here and the tea's hot, might as well come in before the next storm hits." Daniel hesitated. "Only if you'll let me stay." Clara studied him, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his fingers still clutched the newspaper like an offering. This wasn't the man who'd walked away. This was someone being remade. She stepped aside. "Come in, Daniel." Inside, as rain began to patter against the roof, he sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where Clara had once cried over his abandonment. Now he placed the newspaper down, folded neatly to the editorial page. "I also called Vanessa this morning," he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. "Why?" "She texted me last night. Said she'd make it all go away if I came back. That she'd retract everything. If I promised to cut ties with you and the foundation." Clara's hands tightened around her mug, and he met her gaze, unflinching. "I told her the only thing that needs to go away is the lie we both lived, and that I'd rather lose everything than lose the chance to know my son." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of awe, because this quiet courage, this costly truth, was the man she'd always believed he could be. Just then, the baby kicked hard, right where Daniel's hand had rested days before. Clara placed her palm over the spot and smiled through her tears. "He knows you, Daniel. He's been waiting." Daniel reached out slowly, not to touch her, but to rest his hand on the table between them, an offering of presence, not pressure. "I'm here," he whispered, "however long it takes." Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows like 1,000 prayers finally being answered. And in that humble kitchen, surrounded by steam and scripture and the quiet hum of a life being rebuilt, 2 souls who had once been torn apart by pride began, slowly, to stitch themselves back together. Not with grand gestures, but with daily choices to trust, to speak truth, and to let grace do what power never could. He hadn't seen Pastor Eli James in 15 years. Not since the old man had baptized him at 16 in the creek behind the Ohio church, saying, "You've got fire in you, son. Don't let the world turn it to ash." Now, Daniel knocked on the center's side door, heart pounding like a boy seeking shelter. It opened instantly. Pastor Eli stood there, older, thinner, his silver hair cropped close, but his eyes sharp as ever. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at Daniel the way a doctor might examine a wound with sorrow, but no surprise. "Took you long enough," he said simply. Daniel's throat tightened. "I didn't know if you'd see me." "God's door is always open," Eli said, stepping aside, "even for prodigals who traded their birthright for a mirror." Inside, the center buzzed with life. Children laughing in the gym, volunteers packing meals in the kitchen. The scent of cinnamon and soup warming the air. Felt nothing like a boardroom, everything like home. Eli led him to a small office cluttered with books and framed photos, mission trips, baptisms, community cleanups. On the desk sat a worn copy of the same Bible Daniel now carried in his coat. "You've been watching me," Daniel said, not as an accusation but in awe. "I've been praying for you," Eli corrected gently. "Every Sunday, even when you stopped answering your mother's calls. Even when you married Clara and forgot to thank God for her." Daniel winced. "I thought I was building something great." "You were building a monument to yourself," Eli said, not unkindly. "And monuments crumble, but a life rooted in love that lasts." He poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented pot. "Clara came to see me last week." Daniel froze. "She did. She didn't ask for advice," Eli continued, handing him a cup. "She asked for wisdom, said she felt torn between protecting her son and giving you a chance to become the man your son needs." He looked Daniel in the eye. "She's willing to forgive, Daniel, but forgiveness isn't the same as trust. And trust is earned in the dirt, not the spotlight." Daniel stared into his coffee, the steam warming his face like a tear he couldn't shed. "I don't even know where to start." "Start here," Eli said, nodding toward the gym. "We're short on volunteers for the after-school program. Kids need tutors, mentors, men who show up, even when no one's watching." Daniel looked toward the open door, where a boy no older than 10 struggled with a math worksheet, tongue poking out in concentration. "That's Micah," Eli said softly. "His dad walked out last year. Says rich men always leave." The word struck like a blow. Daniel set down his coffee. "I'll stay." Eli nodded. "Good. But don't do it for Clara. Don't do it for your son. Do it because your soul is starving, and service is the only food that fills it." Later that afternoon, as Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor helping Micah with fractions, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A headline alert: Vanessa Sterling files lawsuit against Clara Bennett, alleges emotional distress and defamation. His stomach dropped, but this time he didn't reach for his phone. He looked at Micah's furrowed brow, at the pencil gripped tight in small, determined fingers. "Try it again," Daniel said gently. "You're closer than you think." And for the first time in years, he meant it. Not about math, but about everything. That evening, as he walked back to the subway, rain soaking his shoulders, he called Clara. She answered on the first ring. "Daniel, I spent the day with a boy who thinks all rich men leave," he said, voice thick. I think I need to prove him wrong." There was a pause. Then, softly, "You're already starting to." He stopped under a street lamp, rain glistening on his face. "Clara, what if I never fully earn your trust?" "Then you'll keep showing up anyway," she said. "Because love isn't a transaction, Daniel. It's a promise. And promises are kept even when they're hard." He closed his eyes. "I'm learning. I know," she whispered. "And so is he." Daniel pressed a hand to his chest, where something long frozen was finally thawing. "Tell me his name again." "Eli," she said, "after the man who never stopped believing you'd come back." Tears mixed with rain on his cheeks. "Eli," he repeated, as if tasting grace for the first time. And as he stood there, soaked and shivering but strangely whole, he realized Reedham passed New York, her hands resting lightly on her belly. Inside, 50 women sat on folding chairs, some cradling babies, others with exhaustion etched deep in their eyes. They'd come after seeing flyers pinned to laundromats, churches, bus stops, hope for mother's support, dignity, a fresh start. hosted by the Bennett Foundation. No cameras, no press, just truth in action. Daniel stood just outside the door, hesitant. He'd driven her here, but hadn't planned to stay. "I don't belong in there," he'd said quietly in the car. "Not yet." But Clara had turned to him, eyes steady. "You belong wherever you're willing to serve." Now, as she began to speak, her voice warm and clear, he lingered in the hallway, listening. "Many of you have been told you're too broken to matter," Clara said, scanning the room. "That your past defines your future. But I'm here to tell you, your child doesn't see your mistakes. They see your love. And love rebuilds." A young woman in the back raised her hand, voice trembling. "What if the father's gone? What if he doesn't care?" Clara didn't flinch. "Then you raise your child knowing this God sees you. And he's already writing a story where your pain becomes someone else's hope." Daniel's breath caught. He thought of Micah, of Eli, of the son growing inside Clara who didn't know his name yet, but would one day ask, "Was my father present?" He stepped inside. All eyes turned. Murmurs rippled through the room. They knew who he was, the billionaire, the one who left. Clara didn't pause. She simply nodded toward an empty chair in the corner. "Daniel's here to listen and to learn." He sat, head bowed, feeling the weight of their stares, not as judgment, but as witnesses to his reckoning. After the session, as women lined up for care packages, diapers, formula, handwritten notes of encouragement, Clara moved slowly among them, hugging, praying, remembering names. One older woman, gray-haired and weary, stopped Daniel as he helped stack boxes. "You're the father," she said, not unkindly. He nodded, throat tight. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, then placed a gnarled hand on his arm. "My son left me when I was 6 months along with his sister. Said he wasn't ready. 40 years later, he came back, worn thin by life, full of regret." Her eyes softened. "But my daughter, she never needed him to be perfect. She just needed to know he tried." Daniel's vision blurred. "I'm trying." "Good," she said, squeezing his arm. "Then keep trying, even when it's hard, especially then." Later, as they walked back to the car, Clara took his arm. Not for support, but solidarity. "You stayed," she said softly. "I wanted to hear you speak," he admitted. "Not as an heiress, as a mother, as my son's first home." She stopped beneath a blooming dogwood, petals drifting around them like blessings. "He's due in 6 weeks." Daniel froze. 6 weeks, she nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You'll be there, not because I'm giving you permission, but because you've shown up when it cost you everything." He looked at her, really looked, saw the quiet strength, the unshakable faith, the grace that refused to keep score. "What if I panic?" he whispered. "What if I'm not ready?" Clara placed his hand on her belly. "Feel that?" A strong, rolling kick pulsed beneath his palm. "He's not waiting for you to be perfect," she said, eyes glistening. "He's waiting for you to be his." Just then, her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. Vanessa dropped the lawsuit. Publicly, said, "Further conflict serves no one." But she's scheduled a solo interview with Harper's next week. Title, "The Truth About Clara Bennett." Clara's smile faded. "She's not done." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Let her talk. The truth doesn't need defending. It just needs living." Clara looked at him, surprised. "When did you start sounding like Aunt Miriam?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "When I realized wisdom isn't found in boardrooms, but in kitchens, chapels, and rooms full of women who've been told they don't matter." As they drove home, the city glowing gold in the late afternoon light, Clara rested her head against the window, one hand on her belly, the other resting lightly on Daniel's arm. And for the first time, it didn't feel like rescue. It felt like partnership. Because redemption wasn't a single grand gesture. It was showing up, day after day, in the ordinary moments with open hands and a humble heart. And somewhere in I was used Vanessa Sterling's confession about the Bennett Whitmore affair. She didn't need to read it. She'd seen the teasers, Clara manipulated Daniel's guilt. The inheritance was a trap. I only wanted to protect him. Inside, Aunt Miriam stirred oatmeal on the stove, humming an old hymn, "Be still, my soul," as if to quiet the storm before it broke. Daniel arrived just after 9, not in a luxury sedan, but on foot, shoulders hunched against the wind, eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. He'd spent the last week splitting his days between the community center and late-night calls with lawyers, trying to trace Vanessa's sudden change of heart. Something didn't add up. "You saw it," he said, voice low as he sat beside Clara on the step. She nodded, not looking up. "She's painting me as a schemer who lured you back with pregnancy and power." "She's terrified," Daniel said, not in defense, but in clarity. "Not of you, of being irrelevant." Clara finally turned to him. "What if people believe her? Then they'll see what happens next," he said firmly. "Because truth isn't a story, it's a life. And your life, it's already speaking louder than her lies." Just then, Thomas Greer appeared at the gate, briefcase in hand, face grim. "We have a problem." Clara's stomach tightened. "What now?" "Vanessa didn't just give an interview," Thomas said, stepping closer. "She handed Harper's an anonymous source, a former foundation accountant, who claims you diverted $12 million to a private offshore account weeks before announcing your pregnancy." Daniel shot to his feet. "That's impossible. The accounts are frozen until probate finalizes." "Exactly," Thomas said, "which means it's fabricated. But Harper's verified the whistleblower's identity with a fake ID we traced back to a shell company linked to Vanessa's family trust." Clara's breath caught. "She's not just lying. She's manufacturing evidence. And if this publishes as fact," Thomas added, "the SEC will reopen the investigation. The foundation could be frozen for months, maybe years. People in Sudan, in Nepal, they'll lose everything." Silence fell, heavy as stone. Then, from inside the house, the phone rang. Miriam answered. A moment later, she stepped onto the porch, eyes wide. "It's Elizabeth Hartwell," she says. "They're already moving." Clara stood, wincing slightly as a sharp cramp seized her side. "Who's moving, Vanessa?" Miriam said. "She's calling emergency board members right now, pushing for a vote to replace you as trustee before the baby comes. She's saying you're too unstable, too compromised." Daniel looked at Clara, truly looked, saw the fear flicker in her eyes, then vanish beneath a wave of resolve. "She's counting on me to hide," Clara whispered, "to retreat into privacy and let her rewrite the narrative. Then let's give her something else to write about," Daniel said. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Eli, it's Daniel. I need every volunteer from New Hope, and anyone who's ever been helped by Clara's work. Churches, shelters, clinics, call them all. Tell them to gather at City Hall tomorrow at noon." He paused. "Tell them it's time to bear witness." Clara stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Vanessa thinks power lives in headlines," he said, eyes blazing. "But real power lives in people. And your people, they're ready to speak." That afternoon, while Daniel coordinated with community leaders across the city, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Elizabeth Hartwell on speakerphone. "We'll release the full Geneva Vault ledger publicly tonight," Elizabeth said. "Every transaction, every beneficiary name, fully audited. Let them see the truth is cleaner than their lies." "And the fake whistleblower?" Clara asked. "We'll expose the shell company," Elizabeth replied. "But be ready, Vanessa will cry conspiracy. She'll say we're framing her." Clara closed her eyes, one hand on her belly, where Eli kicked fiercely, as if echoing her resolve. "Then let her," she said softly, "because tomorrow I won't be defending myself. I'll be introducing the world to the women who've been lifted by this foundation. The mothers, the orphans, the healed." She opened her eyes, clear and steady. "Let her lie stand next to their truth, and let the world decide which one breathes." That night, as rain began to fall again, Daniel found Clara on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the sky. "You should rest," he said gently. "I'm afraid if I close my eyes, she whispered. I'll wake up and this will all be a dream. He sat beside her, not too close, but near enough to share the quiet. It's real, Clara. You're real. And tomorrow, the world will see what I've finally learned, that the greatest wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in the courage to love when it costs you everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment. And in that fragile touch, under a sky full of rain and stars, two souls who had been shattered by pride began to believe, really believe, that grace could rebuild even the deepest ruins. Because tomorrow wasn't about winning. It was Elias, voice urgent, trembling. Vanessa's holding an emergency press conference at City Hall before ours. She's bringing the whistleblower. And she's filed a motion to declare Clara mentally unfit due to hormonal instability and grandiose delusions. They're using the pregnancy against her. Daniel had stared at the ceiling, heart hammering. They're not just attacking her legacy, they're trying to steal her dignity. Now, as he buttoned a simple white shirt, the same one he'd worn at St. Luke's, he heard a soft knock. Clara stood in the hallway, dressed in a modest lavender dress, her belly full and low, her eyes tired but steady. She held a folder in one hand. I couldn't stay away, she said quietly. Not today. He stepped back, letting her in. You should be resting. You're due any day. She gave a small, wry smile. Rest won't stop her. Truth will. She set the folder on his desk. This is everything. The audit trail, the forged ID, the shell company. Elizabeth and Thomas compiled it overnight. She paused, then met his gaze. I need you to stand with me today, Daniel. Not as my husband, not as a billionaire, but as the father of my son, and as a man who chooses truth, even when it costs him. He nodded, throat tight. I'm already there. At City Hall Plaza, the crowd was already gathering, hundreds of people, maybe thousands. Mothers with strollers, elders in wheelchairs, young men from the Bronx Center, nurses from the Nairobi Clinic Satellite in Queens. They held signs not of accusation, but of testimony. Clara gave my daughter clean water. The foundation saved my son's life. She saw me when no one else did. Vanessa stood on a raised platform, flanked by sleek lawyers and a nervous-looking man in a cheap suit, the so-called whistleblower. Cameras surrounded them like a cage of vultures. And so, out of deep concern for the vulnerable, Vanessa was saying, voice honeyed with false sorrow, I urge the board to place the Bennett Foundation under temporary neutral stewardship until Ms. Bennett can receive proper psychological evaluation. The crowd murmured, uneasy. Then Clara stepped forward. No podium, no entourage, just her. One hand resting on her belly, the other holding the folder like a shield of light. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Vanessa, she said, clear and calm. You claim I'm unstable, but the only instability here is your desperation to control a story you never understood. She opened the folder and held up a document. This man, she nodded to the whistleblower, was paid $75,000 by a company owned by your cousin. Here's the bank transfer. Here's the contract. She turned to the cameras. And here's the real ledger from the Bennett Foundation. Every dollar accounted for. Every life changed. Gasps rippled through the press. Vanessa's smile faltered. This is a setup. She's manipulating. Then explain this, Daniel said, stepping beside Clara. He held up his phone, playing a recording. Vanessa's voice, sharp and cold, from a call intercepted by Elias. Just say she forced you to lie. Say she threatened your family. Once the foundation's under my control, you'll get double. And if you talk, you'll disappear. The plaza went dead silent. Vanessa paled. That's edited. It's not. But the crowd had already turned. A woman from the front row, Maria, the young mother Clara had helped months ago, stepped forward, voice shaking but strong. I was homeless when Clara found me. She didn't ask for my story. She gave me a home. She turned to Vanessa. You talk about protecting the vulnerable, you've never even seen us. One by one, others spoke, names, faces, stories. Ugandan doctor, a teenage girl from a shelter, an elderly widower whose wife received palliative care through the foundation. Their voices rose not in anger, but in witness. And with each word, Vanessa's power crumbled. By noon, reporters were no longer quoting her. They were live-streaming Clara's quiet strength, Daniel's public repentance, the sea of ordinary people standing for extraordinary grace. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Daniel walked Clara to a bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree. She winced, gripping his arm. "Clara," he asked, alarmed. She took a slow breath. "It's time." His eyes widened. "Now," she nodded, tears in her eyes, but smiling. "After everything, he's coming." As Daniel hailed a cab, his phone buzzed. A text from Elias Board just voted. Unanimous. Vanessa's removed from all foundation matters. And Daniel, they offered you a seat on the Ethics Council. Said the world needs more men who choose truth over power. He looked at Clara, her hand in his, her face radiant through the pain. "I don't want a seat," he whispered. "I just want to be his father." She squeezed his hand. "Then come. He's waiting." And as the cab pulled away from the plaza, leaving behind the ruins of lies and the birth of something new, a single truth echoed in the spring air: redemption isn't loud. It arrives quietly in a hospital room, in a father's trembling hands, in a mother's whispered prayer, and in the first cry of a child who was loved. Before Daniel sat beside the bed, still in the same clothes from the plaza, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if afraid to move. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived at the hospital. He'd held Clara's hand through every contraction, whispered verses from Psalm 139 when her breathing grew ragged, and when Eli finally cried his first breath into the world, Daniel had wept, quiet, broken sobs of awe and repentance. Now he simply watched the way Clara traced her finger over her son's cheek, watched the rise and fall of the tiny chest, watched the miracle he'd almost missed. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, voice rough with emotion. Clara looked up at him, eyes glistening. "He's been waiting for you." Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't know how to be what he needs." "You already are," she said softly. "You showed up. You chose truth. You chose him, even when it cost you everything." A long silence settled between them, filled only by Eli's soft breaths and the distant hum of the hospital. Then Clara shifted slightly, wincing as she adjusted the baby in her arms. "There's something I need to say, Daniel. Not as a condition, not as a test, but as a promise." He turned to her, fully present. "I forgive you," she said, her voice steady, clear as a bell. "Not because what you did was small, but because what God has done in us is greater." Tears spilled down Daniel's cheeks. "Clara, I don't deserve that." "No," she agreed gently. "But grace isn't about deserving. It's about receiving. And I won't let bitterness steal one more moment from him." She looked down at Eli, then back at Daniel. "You're his father. And if you keep walking this path, humbly, honestly, day by day, you'll be more than that. You'll be his hero." Daniel reached out slowly, not for the baby, but for Clara's hand. She let him take it, her fingers curling around his with a trust that still felt like a miracle. Just then, Eli stirred, his tiny face scrunching before letting out a soft cry. Clara smiled. "He's hungry." She began to unbutton her gown with practiced ease, but paused, looking at Daniel. "You can stay, if you want." He nodded, heart pounding. "I want." As she nursed Eli, Daniel watched. The intimacy, the quiet strength, the sacred rhythm of mother and child. This was where empires were truly built. Not in boardrooms, but in bedrooms. Not in headlines, but in heartbeats. "He has your eyes," Daniel murmured. Clara smiled. "And your stubborn brow." They both laughed. Soft, tentative, like they were learning a new language. Later, as twilight deepened outside, a nurse quietly entered with a Polaroid camera. "Would you like a photo, just the three of you?" Clara looked at Daniel, question in her eyes. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." They sat together on the edge of the bed, Clara holding Eli, Daniel with one arm gently around her shoulders, careful not to crowd, not to assume. The flash popped. In that single frame captured. In grainy black and white, not a billionaire, not an heiress, but a family. Broken, healed, beginning again. After the nurse left, Daniel stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life below. "I resigned from Whitmore Global this morning," he said quietly. "Effective immediately." Clara's breath caught. "Daniel, that was your life." "It was a shadow," he corrected, turning back to her. "This you, him, this quiet truth is my life now, and I've accepted a position with the foundation. Not as a figurehead, as a volunteer, starting with the Uganda Land Reconciliation Project." He paused. "I'll spend the next year listening to the people my family hurt, learning how to make things right, not with money, but with presence." Clara's eyes filled. "That's the man I always believed you could be." He walked back to the bed and knelt beside it, not as a plea, but as an offering. "I don't know if we'll ever be what we were, Clara, but if you'll let me, I'd like to build something new, something real." She looked down at Eli, then back at Daniel. "We'll take it one day at a time." And in that simple phrase, "one day at a time," lay the whole gospel, not perfection, but perseverance. Not a grand finale, but a daily choice to love, to trust, to believe the best is still ahead. Outside, the city roared on, unaware that in this quiet hospital room, a legacy had been reclaimed. Not through power, but through pardon. Not through wealth, but through wonder. And as Eli slept inside, laughter echoed down the hallways, children painting murals in the art room, teens tutoring one another in the study lounge, elders sharing stories over chamomile tea in the sunlit atrium. And in the office that once held filing cabinets and outdated computers, Clara sat at a reclaimed wood desk, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, Eli asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest, his tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her sweater. The door creaked open. Daniel stepped in, holding 2 mugs of tea and a stack of blueprints, plans for the first reconciliation village in Uganda, where displaced families would finally return to land once stolen by his grandfather's company. He'd spent the last 5 months there, living in a modest mud-brick home, listening more than speaking, planting trees alongside the very men whose fathers had been driven from that soil. He set the mugs down and smiled when he saw Eli sleeping. "He's getting heavier." Clara nodded, brushing a curl from her son's forehead. "He knows you're back. He stayed awake all morning waiting." Daniel's eyes softened. He didn't reach for Eli immediately, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Every time he held his son, it felt like a gift he hadn't earned, but one he'd been entrusted with all the same. He knelt beside the desk, his voice low. "The elders approved the land transfer today. They're calling it the place of mended ground." He looked up at Clara, eyes shining. "They asked me to bring you both. When Eli's old enough to walk the soil." Clara's breath caught. "You did it." "No," he said gently. "We did. You forgave. I listened. And God healed what we couldn't fix." Just then, Eli stirred, blinking open eyes that were unmistakably Daniel's. Deep brown, curious, full of light. He cooed softly, reaching a wobbly hand toward his father. Daniel's heart swelled. He lifted him carefully, cradling him against his chest. "Hey, little man. Miss me?" Eli gurgled, grabbing Daniel's collar with a grip surprisingly strong. Clara watched them. The man who once chose glitter over grace now covered in Ugandan dust and baby spit up, his face alight with a joy money could never buy. She thought of the penthouse, the galas, the cold silences. And she thought of the sunlight, simplicity, and a love rebuilt not on perfection, but on daily choices to stay. Later that evening, they walked home through the park, Eli in Daniel's arms, Clara beside him, their shoulders brushing like old friends who'd weathered the storm and found shelter together. "I got a call from Vanessa today," Daniel said quietly. Clara tensed slightly. What did she want? "She's leaving the country. Moving to Monaco. Said she's starting fresh." He paused. "She asked me to tell you. She's sorry. Not for the cameras. Just because it's true." Clara was silent for a long time. Then she nodded. "I hope she finds peace." "She won't?" Daniel said softly. Until she learns what you taught me, that real worth isn't in what you have, but in who you love and how you serve. They reached the brownstone. Miriam stood on the porch, holding a basket of fresh bread and knitted booties for Eli's first steps. Whenever they came. Inside, over a simple dinner of lentil soup and crusty bread, Daniel looked at Clara, then at Eli playing with a wooden rattle on the floor. I used to think success meant never needing anyone, he said. But you showed me the opposite, that real strength is letting yourself be loved, and loving back, even when you're scared. Clara reached across the table, her hand covering his. And you showed me that a man can fall and still rise. Eli babbled happily, kicking his legs, as if celebrating the truth unfolding around him. That night, after Eli was tucked into his crib and the house grew quiet, Daniel stood on the porch alone, looking up at the stars. He didn't pray for more. He didn't ask for grandeur. He simply whispered, "Thank you for letting me come home." From the doorway, Clara watched him. This man who had once walked away from everything that mattered, now standing barefoot on worn wood, heart open,